too complex, much too complex, too complex, much too complex, too complex, too complex, too complex.
Good afternoon. My name is James K. Holder II. Some of you may know me as Sir James II, and I'd like to welcome you back to Not on My Watch. As always, I'd like to ask you to like, share, comment, and subscribe. I want you to retweet this video and repeat this. If you're watching, today is Wednesday, October 24th, 2018, and we are just 13 days out from the midterm elections, and it is tragic to report that the culture of this race and this time in our country is devolving to a point, I fear, that is approaching no return. We've all witnessed the divisive rhetoric that has been coming from the White House since before Donald Trump was actually inaugurated or elected, and now it's manifesting itself in threats to former Democratic presidents and their families, including the Obamas and the Clintons. Today, this morning, many people were shocked to find that extremists had sent bombs, pipe bombs, to both former presidential families. And I'm sad to say that I'm not shocked by this type of behavior, only because when the fear-mongering and the stoking of anger and white-hot rage happens, and it keeps coming from the loudest voices and the media keeps amplifying it, what do you expect people to do? And so I'm not going to talk about this story. The Secret Service is in place. Thankfully, they're doing their jobs to protect American citizens, including Barack and Michelle Obama, and also Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton. But beyond that, I just think that it is on you, the viewer, the voter, the citizen, to condemn this behavior. And not just by saying, oh, this is heartbreaking or this is sad. It's up to you to stop giving support and your vote to the people who are amplifying this threat of a message. I mean, you've got Nancy Pelosi getting shouted down and intimidated at political rallies. All these people are trying to do is support the policies that they believe in for American citizens. It's not about taking anything from you. So this whole fear and threatening and attacking people and lack of civility is really just gotten to a point where it's untenable. And really, I'm tired of hearing the both sides argument too. So all of the people on the left and the right who want to talk about the both sides of the issue, and Democrats are bad too because Mitch McConnell got yelled at a restaurant, that's not the same as sending a pipe bomb to somebody's front door. So if you want to take a stand, if you want to be a responsible citizen, you need to do what you can within your resources. That means your vote, your calls to elected officials, to get them to stop stoking this worst aspect of American society so that people don't die and people aren't hurt in the process. Because we've seen it happen over and over again when the president continually gives cover to the murderers of Heather Heyer. And any other example that you've seen, whether it be police brutality, whether it be mobs who attack protesters at Donald Trump's rallies before the election, this type of violence only begets more violence. So I just want to put a pin in it there, and then I want to move on to the next story. Now, mind you, most of what I do on this show is going to be focused on Georgia for the next few days. Not really national stories, but just what's going on in Georgia, because there's a lot of significant occurrences here right in the state. So I want to talk to you just from my personal experiences. And one of the biggest things that's happened recently was that Rolling Stone reported, based on leaked audio that they got of Secretary of State and gubernatorial candidate for the Republicans in Georgia, Brian Kemp, basically having a discussion at a closed-door meeting about the impact of voter suppression and the need to make sure that Republican turnout is higher, because he fears that early voting turnout is going to actually impact the race on him negatively. So let me read that audio, because of course Rolling Stone is not letting people just dub the audio, and I don't want to get sued. So forgive me for reading, but this is my best Brian Kemp impersonation. as we are going into the start of early voting with the literally tens of millions of dollars that they're putting behind the get out and vote efforts for their base, a lot of that was absentee ballot requests that had just an unprecedented number of that, which is something that continues to concern us, especially if everybody uses and exercises their right to vote, which they absolutely can, and mails those ballots in. We gotta have heavy turnout to offset that. Okay, that was a cross between Brian Kemp and I don't know who that was a cross between. That was horrible. Anyway, but Brian Kemp is currently being sued by a number of groups here in Georgia, including the ACLU, for allegedly tampering with the election. There have been reports of a targeted system of efforts to disenfranchise as many as 900,000 Georgia voters. Now, this includes just the tossing of 53,000 absentee ballots, specific things that are happening in the county, and much of this is being promulgated, as Stacey Abrams would say, by the use of this policy called exact match. Now, exact match is a policy that basically allows the poll, whoever is taking your ID at the poll in Georgia, to determine whether the address on the voter log matches, and the address and your name and birth date match with the information on your ID that you present. And if there's any discrepancy, let's say your name on your ID is William and your name on your voter registration is Bill, or your name is misspelled on one of them, or one is a junior and one is the second, or any number of things could create a disparity between your ID and your actual voter log printout. And so then it would basically flag in the system, and that poll worker would be able to determine whether or not they were going to let you vote at that time. And if they don't let you vote, then you have to fill out a provisional ballot, which may or may not get counted. Provisional ballots are just a different thing because they don't fall into the same system of votes as everything else. I did an actual coverage of a town hall where Stacey Abrams spoke directly to the issue of exact match, which is featured in a previous episode of Not on My Watch. I hope you'll check that out. Frankly, this is an issue that could really impact the election, and this is something we have to watch out for. Now, early voting has already begun in Georgia, and it's been going on for about a week and a half maybe. And it is important to understand, if you're a Georgia citizen, or Georgia resident rather, you can vote up until the Friday before the election at the early polling locations. Most of them close at 7 p.m. If you visit the sos.ga.gov page, it will tell you where the early voting locations are per county. It'll tell you the hours of those locations and everything you need to know to go access the vote. But I will tell you that, and so make sure that you vote early by November 2nd, or else you will have to vote at your designated polling location, whatever that is. I want to talk about my trip to the polls. Now, yesterday, I went to go vote early in Georgia. The whole process took me about an hour and 10 minutes, and there were some hang-ups. Now, I was able to vote at the end of the day, but I posted a thread about it, and it's currently pinned to my Twitter page at YesSirJames, and it describes basically the step-by-step, the play-by-play of me trying to just go vote yesterday. And many people have taken to this thread and just looked at it and said, fine, he wasn't disenfranchised, it didn't stop him from voting, but the number of steps that I had to go through just to cast that ballot seemed extensive. I mean, I think most people would look at that thread and tell you off top that it was a prohibitive process to be able to go cast a ballot. Now, briefly, a couple of hangups that I had in going to vote. One, when I went to the Secretary of State's website to double check that the early voting location that I'm used to going to was still an early voting location, I looked at the address And it kind of threw me off because it was listed as 130 Peachtree Street. And what a lot of people don't understand about, there's two things about Atlanta. One, every other street is named Peachtree Street. So it's anytime you see a Peachtree Street address, you need to really double check. Make sure that it's Peachtree Street, not Peachtree Road. Make sure that you know, is it Peachtree Place? Is it Peachtree? I mean, it could be anything, and it could be any number of, there's a West Peachtree Street. There's a lot of different things going on with the word Peachtree. So that kind of threw me off because I'm used to going via I believe the other address that you can search for that complex is 88 Pryor Street. And that's where I normally enter from the Pryor Street entrance. So I type in 130 Peachtree Street to the Uber. I took an Uber because my car isn't working. And it starts taking me over there towards the Equitable Building, which is basically near Midtown. It almost took me to a whole other part of town, and I had to hop out of the Uber halfway through and walk because, and thank God I knew that the Uber, because the Uber driver was about to hop on the expressway, and I was like, you are not about to take me on the expressway. That's not where we're going. So I get out of the car, I walk to the polling location, and then of course I double check it on the website, like what happened? Why did it do that? And it turns out, you know, the address for the polling location is actually 130 Peachtree Street Southwest. It is not 130 Peachtree Street. 130 Peachtree Street Northwest is north of the Equitable Building. It's almost in Midtown, basically. So you really have to watch for that. And in fact, I went as far as to write the Secretary of State on the same page where you search for what they call advanced voting locations. They have an email there and a form. So I submitted a form basically telling them that this was a problem that I experienced and asking them to update it on the site so other people don't face that problem. We can be upset about these sort of types of hang-ups or these things that might seem like deliberate dilatory tactics for voters, but really unless you bring it up to them directly, you can only assume it was an honest mistake. I mean, not that I expect anything to be honest on that end, because again, he's currently being sued by a number of civil rights groups, but over these same types of things. But this is a website that's run by Brian Kemp. And when you write in a complaint, it goes to people who work for Brian Kemp. So you have to understand, take Brian Kemp out of it. The people who work under him in his administration are probably inclined to make sure that he wins via little mistakes like this, because when he wins the governor's position, they start getting appointments. If he loses, all those people get fired. So, I mean, potentially. So you really have to be careful when it comes to stuff like that. And that was a part of my experience. You know, a lot of people, I think I was reading the comments from voters in other states, and a lot of them didn't understand why, you know, didn't know what voter ID looked like or how voter ID played a part in disenfranchising voters. They really didn't understand how things like a security checkpoint, because again, the early voting location that's closest to my house is actually in a government facility that has also the police headquarters of Atlanta. They have a number of judges have their offices there, and it's also next to a federal complex as well. So there's just a lot of security in the area. There's a lot of police, there's armed police officers pretty much everywhere in that location. And so that can be a factor of intimidation for a lot of people. And you do have to go through a metal detector to get into that building. So if that's something that is, you know, would stop you, you would need to know that before you went to go vote at that location. So I just want to put out all that stuff out there. The thread is available. I'll link it in the description below. And I also, really what I want to talk about today was the governor's debate in Georgia. Now this is done by the Atlanta Press Club. It's called the Loudermilk Young debate series. And this is how they do all the debates in Georgia races, whether it's mayor's candidates. They did one for the primary, and I reported on that when it was that time, Stacey Abrams versus Stacey Evans on the Democratic side. Now, this debate was kind of a hot mess, and I kind of just want to talk about the debate at large. So one, there was a fire alarm that went off in the building at the outset of this hour-long debate. So that took about 4 minutes off of the program timing. And that it was, you know, Lisa Rayam, who is she is a very well-known journalist and moderator here in Atlanta. And she did a really good job. She remained calm and composed under, you know, the stress of everything. But they basically had to stop the taping to fix the problem in the building and then come back to the actual debate. Now, during the debate, one thing that did bother me was that you have Stacey Abrams, who's polling at about 48%. You've got Brian Kemp, who's polling also at about 48%. They're really neck and neck in the state in terms of polling. And then somehow within that 1 to 2% margin remaining, you have the Libertarian candidate, Ted Metz, who's just taking up room in the debate. Because no one's really interested in what Ted Metz has to say. He is a Libertarian candidate. No one knew of him. He's polling way behind. And he really didn't seem to be that organized in terms of his thoughts or his plans. It was just what you would expect from a Libertarian candidate, which is not a lot of detail, talking about broad scope perspective on what the Libertarian Party stands for, and using that really to just distract from the main race, because again, he's not going to be the next governor of Georgia. One of these two people is, but he can influence the vote enough to either trigger a runoff or send the election to one of the other people, despite what Georgia voters really wanted. So that's something that did concern me. I want to just take a moment to comment on pieces that I observed from each candidate and how I think they performed. I think that Stacey Abrams, for all of her strengths, I think she stumbled when it came to levying an attack against anybody else. Of course, she didn't bother to attack Ted Metz, but she did try to kind of unfurl some talking points against Brian Kemp, and she was able to get, when it was in her wheelhouse and when it was about her programs, about her policies and what she believes, she was very eloquent. She put it together very well and delivered on a message. But when it came to, you could tell when somebody wrote a line for her to try to throw him off or try to make him look bad because she stumbled over the words. I just feel like that's not her spirit, that's not her character, so she didn't do that dirty politics line very well. She tried, it didn't land. So I wasn't convinced by that, Stacey. But I did like that you seem to have a very strong presentation on numbers. You seem to know the number of Georgians that are impacted by this policy, the number of Georgians that are impacted by this, and that was kind of, that's always more convincing to me, because that lets me know that you are invested in a solution and you're science and fact-based and not rhetoric-based. And I will only say, the only thing about Stacey Abrams that's interesting, and this is not necessarily a negative, but she always focuses on rural. Every time she talks about Georgia, she talks rural Georgia, rural Georgia, rural Georgia, as opposed to talking about the major metropolitan areas, specifically Atlanta. She is not a very Atlanta-centric candidate in terms of her dialogue. Now, some of this did change, and again, if you go back to watch that barbershop town hall that I covered this week, you might see a different side of that, because she was speaking within Atlanta and answering questions of people in Atlanta. But I think maybe that's a part of her overall strategy to win, trying to build a coalition of voters from across the state of Georgia. Brian Kemp was very much on message about Stacey Abrams and her money problems. So it's like he did a good job of keeping it. He had his major talking points. And I think when you don't have necessarily the policy expertise or the experience, you have to go back to rhetoric. Brian kept talking about how he has 3 teenage daughters. He kept talking about how Stacey Abrams had problems with money or problems paying taxes. He kept basically trying to distract from what it was. He kept trying to draw things out. So every time that he was mentioned, he would ask for a rebuttal, even if he wasn't like entitled to a rebuttal. So he kept trying to argue with Lisa Ram, the moderator, that she was being unfair. He was trying to kind of lay this line that Stacey Abrams was sort of a crook, and that Lisa Ram was not being fair to him at the panel, and all. It was a lot of what you see from the White House, basically. But that's the GOP in a lot of ways. That's how they operate. Brian Kemp, was there anything Brian Kemp also, he seemed to mimic a lot of the goals that Stacey Abrams was trying to do. But he wasn't talking about how he was going to make health insurance more affordable. He kept talking about how Stacey Abrams wanted to have radical policies and make Georgia more liberal than California. He kept talking about how basically she wanted to employ Medicare for all, which was like a radical state-funded. It was this whole, he kept talking about these socialist policies, basically. So he was using this idea that Stacey Abrams is this radical socialist and all these different talking points to basically try to detract support from her based on that. And Ted Metz, bless his heart, was just a hot mess. This man, oh, let me see, was there anything I liked about Brian Kemp? He did a good job of trying to defend his positions, I suppose. I mean, he just, I don't know what you want me to say. Ted Metz was a hot mess. When it came to the closing argument, he spent the whole time talking about hemp, industrial hemp, and how there's a need for hemp baby food and hemp. Everything was about hemp. Everything was about legalizing recreational marijuana. Everything was about the traditional libertarian talking points. And it came down to the end, and he gave his closing argument, and he basically said that Georgia voters should vote for him because it's going to go to a runoff anyway. Lie. He said that Georgia voters need to vote for him to stick it to the oligarchs. Traditional, again, what you expect from a third party. He kept talking about how 45% of registered voters are independent. That is not representative of Georgia specifically because Georgia voters don't specify a party affiliation when they register, so that was irrelevant to Georgia. That might have been a national talking point, but it doesn't really apply here. And he kept talking about the need for third party, He didn't speak to a real solid plan on, okay, how are you going to protect pre-existing conditions? How are you going to stop Donald Trump's Muslim ban from impacting industry in Georgia? How are you going to protect or bolster the film industry? How are you going to attract big companies like Amazon if that's what we want in Georgia? He really didn't speak to any of that stuff. It was just more of the same repeated talking points. So that was not particularly inspiring for me. And one thing that was concerning for me, just as a Georgia voter, when it came down to the question of, is voter suppression going to impact this election, both Brian Kemp and Ted Metz said no. They basically pointed to things like increased early voter turnout to suggest that people weren't being marginalized or kept away from the ballot. And that's not only disappointing, but that's scary. Because if you got Stacey Abrams, who's basically an expert on the topic, talking about how this is a major problem and factor in this race, and you've got two people who, maybe it's due to their demographic, white men are just statistically not the targets of voter suppression in any way in this country. And the tactics employed to keep people from the ballot, like exact match, don't almost never impact straight white men. So with money. So it's just kind of, it's interesting how they were both so convinced that there was no voter suppression happening in Georgia. And I was glad that I had previously announced or really just sort of laid out the narrative of my experience, that I do feel there were some tactics of voter suppression that were at play in me going to vote. So that was my takeaways from the Georgia governor's debate. I'll try to link that event in the bottom just so that you can, or in the description, so that you can see that for yourself. But it really is, it is going to be a race to remember. You have to really take this one seriously because the governor's race, the governor has a lot of power, and Georgia is a major, powerful state in the country. So if, depending on how this goes, it could really, really impact the culture of our society, and especially for Georgians. If you're concerned about law enforcement, police brutality, if you're concerned about vets and their access to health care, if you're concerned about the Muslim ban, if you're concerned about different things that really impact Georgia and our industries and our citizens, and especially education, you have to really vote this go round. And also, there's a referendum on brunch on the ballot. So if you don't care about anything else but drinking, you want to make sure that you go vote to allow the city, which would make it so that Atlanta, I think this might just be for Atlanta voters, but if you go to brunch in Atlanta right now, I think you're not allowed to order a drink until after 2:30 p.m. on Sunday. And this law would make it so that they could serve alcohol as early as 11 a.m. on Sunday, which is kind of, it's kind of a big deal here. A lot of people in the industry, in the restaurant industry, the tourism industry, fought really hard to get that measure on the ballot. So you have to understand that impacts people that you know, whether it's the person, the owner of the neighborhood bar, the owner of the neighborhood restaurant, or even if you just like to go out and host friends, or you have people coming into town and Sunday brunch is something you want to be able to do. I think that's one of those things you really have to take it outside of the shallow aspect of alcohol and really understand that's a tourism thing, and also just a food service industry thing. And a lot of people will probably seek advantage or benefit from that law being passed. So make sure you go vote for that. And with that, I just want to ask you all again to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Make sure to become a subscriber or donor subscriber at human.tv/support. Any donations that you make to the show will go towards creating this show, helping other content creators create their content and promote their content online, so that we have ad-free and free-to-watch content for people to enjoy. I want to thank you all for watching. Make sure that you are registered to vote in your state, and also make sure that you vote early in Georgia by November 2nd, or you vote on the day of elections on November 6th, 2018. Remember to relax, relate, resist. Thank you.
Too complex, much too complex, too complex, too complex, too complex.